Is this one on? Oh, this one? Yeah. It's such a pleasure and an honour to be here today, to be a part of the healing journey with you all from the Black Summer. And we're just so honoured to be here today to help with everyone's healing journey for our country and our land. Gawi bianga garabara, Gawi wianga bemoma, Gawi mujin malin benanga, acknowledging Father Sky, Mother Earth, and those who've walked before us. Warami, Wellamabami, Iora, Giarira Duraman Jalarinya, Gilligan Daranga Daba Wayanga, Dian Garangarang, Buruburungu, Bijigal, Gadumba Dame. Hello and a warm welcome to the Gadigal clan lands of the grass tree people of the Dharug Nation. We gather on country today, the land of my ancestors. I pay my respects to elders past, present and future, and special guests here today. My name is Peter Strawn, Artistic Director of Jannawi Dance Clan, mother of 5, grandmother of 3, wishing you all a safe passage and stay on Gadigal country. Nanga mai nini, Nangamai Bujari, calling in the good spirit, calling in the good dreaming. Nubaringora, Nubaringora, love, country. Thank you. I reckon put it near the door there. The smoke. Now we're going to dance our fire stick reed dance. This song and dance is about women carry the fire, and the fire stick reed song sings about chasing away the darkness and bringing in the light. And that was our welcome dance to welcome you all here today, and it just sings about everyone coming together as one and listening to the storytellers. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you so much for coming today to the Black Summer Vigil, and thank you to Peter Strawn and Jannawi for welcoming us so beautifully so that we could conduct this service in the right way. My name is Annika. I'm the director of the Department of Animals. I made it up. It's a creative project to counter cultural anthropocentrism, with this vigil being the first work. I've been wanting to organise this vigil ever since Black Summer happened. When I was little, we used to go to the coast some summers, and there was a large goanna who lived by the path going through the rainforest to the beach, and our mother would let us leave a hen's egg on a tree stump for her. Sometimes she would be there, and she would make a huge show about coming down from her tree and seizing up the egg while we were there, and it was, the thrill of our lives. And other times we'd wait, and she wouldn't come, and eventually our mother would say, "The goanna is busy. The goanna is elsewhere." And, dejected, we'd go onto the beach, wondering about this mysterious being of the forest. What were her errands? Who did she visit? And if we came back and the egg was gone, we were so thrilled that she had accepted once again our gift. We took so much delight in her existence that if that one goanna had died, then in my own small family, we would have held a state funeral, just for her. But in 2020, 3 billion animals died, and 240 trillion smaller creatures. And the Prime Minister did not even mention it. The media gave it the most cursory attention. And the only thing more deafening than the indifference of the state and of the public narrative is the silence left behind by all those missing creatures. But by gathering here today and by determining to remember them, we can make that silence loud. I have the great honour of welcoming 2 speakers to the stage, first of all. The amazing, and I think she's tuning in today, so hello to everyone tuning in online as well. Alexis Wright, she's a multi-award-winning Waanyi writer and land rights activist. She's the only person to ever have won both the Miles Franklin Award and the Stella Prize, and she has kindly lent her mind to helping us think through this by writing the eulogy. And the eulogy will be delivered by her good friend, Jackie Katona, who is a legal academic, a voice actor, and also a legendary environmental leader. She led the campaign to stop the Jabiluka uranium mine, and she also is a founding member of the Melbourne School of Discontent. So as we welcome her, and by proxy Alexis, could we welcome all and thank all activists and agitators. Thank you.
Thank you, Annika. Look, I play a small part in being asked by Alexis to read to you all her thoughts and her sentiments about the grave experience that we all went through during those days of the Black Summer. So Alexis wishes, and I also wish, to acknowledge and pay my respects to the Gadigal people and to their elders, past and present, the traditional owners and custodians of the unceded sovereign land on which the Black Summer Vigil is taking place. We acknowledge and pay our respects to all Aboriginal people and their sovereign unceded nations. As Alexis is unable to be with you in person today on this important occasion, she asked me to present her words. We both want to acknowledge the organisers of the Black Summer Vigil for ensuring that we remember and honour the 3 billion animals that died in the bushfires in the summer of 2019 and 2020. There should be more and widespread memorials to acknowledge this fateful outcome. Alexis wants you to know that she's humbled and sad of heart to be writing this eulogy. And although the eulogy focuses on animals and living creatures with whom we share our world, she acknowledges the deep and tragic loss of human life in this catastrophe. Many families and communities carry their grief and loss to this day. We acknowledge the livestock and cherished family pets that died in these fires. But Alexis has to ask herself, how many times? What can one person say? How do we create a memorial of words that speaks to the 3 billion animals and the trillions of invertebrates that perished in these firestorms? And what can we say about what kind of custodians we are? How do we honour the spirit of our ancestors on an occasion as momentous as this? Many times since the fires came and finally passed, Alexis thought about the enormity of what happened on vast areas of country throughout our collective homelands. She thought, what can one human being say to render this unimaginable loss when we know in our heart that the human world did not do enough to prevent this disaster? A disaster brought on by the global warming emergency, a disaster that created colossal, unprecedented pyroconvective firestorms. Do we even have the right to speak? Alexis thought about who should be speaking about this, who can reflect on our memories of all these animals that were lost, all these living creatures who lost their right to live out their lives and to continue the lifeblood of their species. Of course, we should all speak. We should all say something of how we feel about what happened. But who should take the lead in expressing the thoughts of the entire continent? Where is the leadership of this country at this time of crisis? There is a need to seek the forgiveness of all these animals that died. We need to speak to the ancestral creators of this continent. Australians must recognise the magnitude and scale of what has happened here. Australians must own up to their neglect in caring for country, the ancestral homelands of all those living creatures who perished. The head of state, a Prime Minister, must step up and lead our response for this loss. Lead the nation in grieving and seeking forgiveness. Say with dignity and honesty what a loss of this magnitude means and what we will do to ensure it never happens again. Yet, where are the heads of government in this global emergency? Where are the world leaders? Where are those that have allowed the global warming disasters of unprecedented and unimaginable scale now occurring with more frequency across this planet? It's troubling that we're not able to find the right way to deal with the magnitude of this loss. Alexis writes that she is not able to come to terms with a loss of this scale. We've seen reports that the ashes from these fires became a massive plume of smoke, circling our planet for months. We've recently read that the fires temporarily depleted the ozone layer by 5%. Surely this loss is a warning that ozone recovery may become slower with increasingly greater and more frequent fires. The rightful sovereign caretakers, guardians, law managers of country, since time immemorial, all carry the weight of this loss. We feel diminished knowing that we were unable to protect our traditional lands. Our sadness haunts country like a sickness. In January 2020, an Australian National University report, the Gamilaroi scholar Amy Thunig said, "Seeing people start to ask what is going on in Australia. Ongoing colonisation, that's going on. This land was nurtured in reciprocal relationships with First Nations peoples for some 120,000 plus years. This is the result of 200 odd years of extractive invasion. Here today, we honour and express our sorrow for the loss of each and every one of the 3 billion animals and all living creatures whose lives were tragically lost in the fires that burnt approximately 30,000 square kilometres of our country. We honour and are sorry for the further loss of the smaller animals, the 240 trillion insects, beetles, butterflies, moths, spiders, yabbies, and other invertebrates estimated to have died while unable to escape the fires that engulfed their rightful world, their ancient and natural homeland. We honour and say thank you to the thousands of brave firefighters and community members who desperately worked hard over soul-destroying weeks and months to save our bushlands and forests and the lives of all the people and living creatures in these places. We honour and say thank you to the many people who rescued badly burned and injured animals and painstakingly nursed and healed these animals with care and compassion before returning them to the bush. In the Aboriginal world, we deeply understand that all animals that belong to this land are our close relatives. We understand the importance of our close interconnectivity with everything in our world. This is the ancient wisdom, the wisdom we must follow. If we care for our country, the country will care for us. Alexis once wrote a libretto for Dirt Song, a musical performance by the Black Arm Band. Her libretto used the voices of elders expressing what country was all about. Their words included, "It comes from where we've been start off, coming up from the ancient song for making country good, looking good all of the time, singing it up, looking after it well, watching my country, watching story, listen for the heartbeat now with the pulse of the land, bringing it up, bring the country back." Australia, already broken by this relationship with the traditional owners of country, became more broken while witnessing the unfathomable scale of this firestorm tragedy. A tragedy took away the fresh breath of the natural world. A tragedy that took away the sound of this country's natural music. A tragedy that took away its peacefulness and powerful ability to calm our spirit. A tragedy that silenced the sounds of its life, like the rustle of animals moving through the bush. A tragedy that silences the songs and voices of the vast multitude of animals, our company, our relatives, that belonged in the bushlands and forests. In this silence, we hear the voice of our conscience. We do not look after the country well enough, the land on which we live. We do not look after the health of our planet that we totally depend on in order to survive. We will never forget what happened, and we will never forget that 3 billion animals and the trillions of other living creatures who died through no doing of their own. We cannot be guided by an ethos of neglect, brokenness of heart, misery of spirit that will lead us into a future world devoid of joy. The world's combined humanity must sing the planet up with careful songs, songs of responsibility and respect. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jackie, and thank you so much, Alexis. Next, we have Greg Mullins. He fought his first big fire at age 12. At age 13, he joined the Duffy's Forest Bushfire Brigade as a volunteer, and then he joined the Fire and Rescue New South Wales full-time. 6 years later, he's been fighting fires ever since. Our most experienced fire commissioner, climate counsellor, and founder, Emergency Leaders for Climate Action. Welcome.
Anyone who didn't get a bit of a tear in the eye hearing that needs to check their pulse, I think. But look, I'd like to acknowledge I'm on Gadigal land. This land was never ceded, but it was taken from the original owners, and part of the mess we're in is because Europeans came here and decided that fire was a bad thing and excluded it. And I was watching that dance and the women with fire, and you saw them putting it down. They used to manage the land beautifully, and it was, the stories about what the land was like, it's nothing like it is now. So there's part of our big problem. I'd like to acknowledge anybody here of Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander background and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So my job is to take you back to Black Summer, less than 4 years ago. Who would think? And it's actually interesting, this time of year in 2020, it was pouring with rain, just like today. The fires had been extinguished on around the 2nd of March. The rains came, the big rains, and then we had 3 years of the Great Deluge. So we had the huge fires, unprecedented fires, and then unprecedented rains. Yeah, so think back to December 2019, Sydney was blanketed in thick, choking smoke, and our air quality was worse than the most polluted cities on the planet. Smoke that would eventually kill about 450 people. 450 versus 3 billion. Think of that number. Millions of hectares of bush, grass and farmland had been burned in every state and territory, but particularly along the east coast and Kangaroo Island, places in South Australia, and the fires continued to grow. Nearly 3,000 homes had been destroyed and dozens of people had been killed by the flames. That was how it was framed in the media, as Annika said. It was about a human tragedy, and it was. And I was out there on the front line, and it was pretty tough coming home, going back out day after day, week after week, month after month, seeing that human tragedy. But I'll get to the tragedy of the natural kingdom shortly. So the media saw it as a human tragedy. There was no mention of the animals until actually months after the fires, and there were some studies done, and I think the first one said about 1 billion animals were killed, and then another one later on said 3 billion animals were killed, displaced or killed or starved or killed by predation after those fires, which is just a staggering number. The amount of bushland burnt, 24 million hectares at least, there's probably more than that nationally. There's never been fires that big. So I had to contend with people like the Deputy Prime Minister of Australia, who said that people like me were inner city latte sipping greenies. Is anyone like that here, by the way? It's a badge of honour. And being abused by the Deputy Premier of New South Wales, saying that we were bastards because we raised climate change during the fires. And that's about the level of politics in this country. So together, now going back a little bit, together with 22 former fire and emergency chiefs in actually February 2019, we saw what was coming. I rang around my former colleagues. I used to head up the National Council for Fire and Emergency Services, as well as being Commissioner of Fire and Rescue New South Wales. Every single one of them that I called, they all had different political persuasions, but they said something really bad is coming our way. We've never had a build-up like this, and the sort of fires we're going to experience, we don't know how we'll contend with them. So we tried to warn the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, and we know how that ended. Didn't end well, but we were mocked. And I remember Alan Jones, he wrote an opinion piece saying these fire chiefs are commenting outside their area of expertise, because after all, what would fire chiefs with 30 or 40 or 50 years experience know about bushfires? Nothing, but Alan knew and Mr Morrison knew. So now I was on the front line of fighting those fires constantly as a volunteer. After retiring as Fire and Rescue Commissioner in 2017, I rejoined my local bushfire brigade. My dad was still alive at that stage. Dad had taught me about the bush. Mum was an environmentalist, so taught me about the bush. They'd taught me about weather patterns, and he'd been saying for years something is very wrong. And that something was climate change. Now, through that summer, I watched as homes burned down in various parts of New South Wales, and I was really saddened, but I knew that they could be rebuilt. But as I watched the huge swathes of New South Wales disappearing under the onslaught of the hottest and driest weather we'd ever experienced and the hottest fires ever recorded on this planet, I knew that some areas would not recover. Actually, in November 2019, I went over to California to the Kincaid fire. I've worked in California quite a bit. I've worked in Spain, France, Canada on bushfires. I spoke to Professor Chris Field at Stanford University, and he said, Greg, what you have to understand is that because of climate change, Mother Nature's using fire to change the environment, changing forest to scrubland to grass, grass to desert. And with that goes entire ecosystems and the animals that live within them. That's what's happening. That's a process we're going through. Australia is a canary in the coal mine, 1.47 degrees of warming on average since 1910 because of the burning of coal, oil and gas. We're addicted to the cheap energy and wealth that comes from that, and it's time to get off it. Now, one day in December 2019, I was fighting fires, the Gospers Mountain mega fire, they called it, out northwest of Sydney. Later in the afternoon, my hands were full just trying to find some bare ground where our teams of firefighters could shelter. There's a kilometres-long wall of flame came towards us with gale force winds behind it. I remember watching the mobs of kangaroos flying past, going across the head of the fire. And I'd seen that so many times over the years, and I said, thank God they know where to go to keep safe. So they're going to be okay. They know where the rivers and the creeks are. They know where the bare ground is. I've seen them jump through flames onto burnt ground. They'll be okay. But I knew that a lot of slow animals, wombats, koalas, others, they weren't going to make it. So that was pretty chilling. A couple of weeks later, on New Year's Eve 2019, I was at Bateman's Bay under a pyroconvective storm, a rare phenomenon. On average, between 1978 and 2018, there were 1.5 a year, and I hadn't really seen that many. There were 35 confirmed events in one 6-month period because it was so bloody hot. Fires like we've never seen before. So I was there watching dozens of homes burning down, sheltering from trees falling down all around us, trying to keep the crews safe. And I saw something by the highway at Bateman's Bay, and I thought, what's that? And through the smoke, it was like evening, but it was 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and it was orange, everything was orange. And I remember seeing flying foxes wheeling in the air, thinking it was night, but it's 45 degrees, so I was clearly distressed and had no idea what was going on. So I walked towards these black objects, and I thought they were bales of hay, and they were smouldering, and there was smoke coming. And it was a mob of kangaroos. And so I lost it because that symbolised to me how we've lost control of this planet. We've come along and stuffed it in 200 years, just 200 years, not working with the environment, working against it, extracting the wealth. A lot of countries have missed out on that wealth, but the oil companies will blame them. It's all a big game. So I struggle with those images, and some weeks later I went back with a film crew from 60 Minutes in the USA. We went to the same spot, I've been to lots of burnt areas, thousands and thousands and thousands over the years, and something was different. And then I realised it was the silence. There were no birds, there were no insects, there were no lizards scrabbling around, there were no ants. There was nothing. It was sterile. It was like an atom bomb had gone off. And in fact, the energy put out was more than 100 atom bombs just by that fire. It was sterile. So look, I've only got a minute. We've got lots of other speakers. So this frightens the hell out of me. We face an existential crisis. We had a bunch of buffheads running this country for a decade who did nothing and lied or were too stupid to understand what was going on. And I am bitter, and I don't often speak like that because I think it's unbecoming, but I'm so angry that nothing was done because we've known for decades that the burning of coal, oil and gas, filling our atmosphere with poison, was doing irreparable damage, and it's speeding up. At the moment, there's bushfires in Thailand. My kids are in Thailand at the moment, my son, daughter-in-law and 2 grandkids. There's bushfires there, there's bushfires in Spain, there's 100 grass fires burning in Oklahoma. It's the wrong time of year. The planet is burning because we've heated it up. We have to take this seriously. I sort of look at it, sorry for the analogy, but this is war. It's an existential crisis. And people have asked me, why do you keep fighting? Because nobody can afford to sit back. They've got to pick a side. And the side I've picked, I'm here with my EV and our house is off the grid, and my wife and I made that decision. And you do everything you possibly can, and if you have a voice, you must use it. And what frightens me, well, even more, is that my grandkids, I can't take them out in the bush like my parents took me, like my wife's parents took her, and show them the animals and show them the beautiful bush, because it's changed forever. It's not coming back in my lifetime or their lifetime, and it's probably going to get worse. So I'll just leave you with this thought. One study in particular says that black summer weather conditions that were unprecedented by 2040 will be average on the east coast of Australia. By 2060 will be exceedingly cool. I don't know how you fight fires in that. So the human race deludes itself that we can adapt and we can get more firefighting aircraft or whatever. Well, that's just not true. So we've got to dial down the heat. We've got to look after the animals and plants and ecosystems that actually support us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Greg, and thank you so much for revisiting some of your most painful memories to share for the public good. I'd next like to welcome Professor Christopher Dickman, internationally recognised ecologist, WWF board member, a fellow of the Australian Academy of Science, and the man behind the 3 billion figure. Please make him welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Annika. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a great honour to be here this afternoon on Gadigal land and to talk to you about an awful event that took place over the 2019-20 summer period, the Black Summer Fires. Before we do that, I'd like to ask you to cast your minds back about 4 years, to the year 2019. It was a tough year all round for nature in Australia. 2019 was the hottest year on record in Australia. It was also the driest. A combination of extreme heat and lack of moisture in the soil, in the vegetation, combined to make for the highest fire danger index that we've seen. It was in the catastrophic category. We knew that something bad was about to happen. Earlier in 2019, and in fact towards the end of 2018, which was also very hot, this combination of conditions had meant that conditions for many of the living creatures in the forest estate were under stress. In northeastern Australia, some 20 to 23,000 spectacled flying foxes died. They succumbed due to heat stress, about a third of the Australian population of this vulnerable species. Millions of fish were dying as well at the same time in the Murray-Darling Basin system. Not quite as many as the current die-off, but nonetheless in the millions, again from excess heat. Species, iconic species such as the koala were also doing it tough, coming into people's gardens, dehydrated. Kangaroos were coming in, sitting under people's sprinklers. It was tough times. In the same year, a collaboration between industry, the government, non-government organisations and academia combined to produce the Threatened Species Index. And this is an index that looks at threatened species in different categories to see how they're faring over time. Starting in 1985, if you look at the decline that has happened in the 3 major groups that are covered by the index, threatened vascular plants, birds and mammals, there have been declines in all these already threatened taxa of between 20 and 78%. So this was the first part of 2019, and it was really just the herald of what was to come later in that year. By July 2019, spot fires were beginning to break out on the east coast. Towards the end of the year, as Greg has said, the fires were becoming more numerous, more widespread and more intense. Even many kilometres from the fire front in Sydney, in coastal areas, you could see, you could feel, taste the smoke in the air. Media coverage at the time was intense. In addition to the human calamity at the time, some of the most harrowing images were those of animals that were fleeing from the flames, injured animals that were being burned, people who were braving the dangers to go after them, to rescue them, to rehabilitate them. If you've spent much time in the forest and woodland estate, you know, of course, that these environments teem with life. It's not just the big, conspicuous animals like kangaroos and koalas. And it seemed to me that the media were showing animals that I guess were the obvious, the iconic faces of the calamity, but there were many more that were not having their stories told. And it set me to thinking and drawing upon some earlier work that I'd carried out with colleagues for WWF, that we might be able to get some estimates of the numbers of animals that were in the path of the fires. So I did some initial simple calculations around the new year between 2019 and 2020. The first numbers came out as being breathtakingly large, in the hundreds of millions. By the 8th of January, as the fires continued to spread, the number went up to 1 billion. That's in New South Wales and Victoria alone. There were fires that were burning in other parts of the forest estate too. By the end of the year, when it was possible to do a complete stocktake, the estimate for vertebrate animals alone was nearly 3 billion. And when you add in the invertebrates, the numbers, of course, rise rapidly into the trillions. These are huge numbers, almost incomprehensibly huge to try to imagine. What did these animals look like? What were they? They were, of course, the cute, the charismatic, the well-known species like koalas and kangaroos. But they included as well many other species, the flying foxes, the other bats, the native rodents, a whole suite of marsupials, the forest-dwelling species like the possums and the gliders, the small insectivorous marsupials, the bandicoots. It included as well whole suites of forest-dwelling birds, of frogs, of reptiles. Some of the reptiles were, in fact, among the most numerous of the casualties. If you look at the numbers of the small skinks and geckos, the dragons, the monitor lizards, and the snakes, these are among the most numerous of all the animals that were in the path of the fires. For me personally, making these estimates was pretty tough. Having first-hand experience with many of these critters, and counting up the numbers that were in the path of the fires wasn't easy. I gave something like 102 interviews in January 2020 alone to the media, and recounting the numbers each time didn't make the task any easier. And I wasn't really even the one who was doing it tough. These were the people really on the front line, the people who were out there fighting the fires, rescuing the animals, doing the rehab, the vets, the carers, all the people who were really doing the hard work, people whom we'll be hearing from, I believe, shortly this afternoon. One of the most frequent questions that I was asked was, well, these numbers are huge. Did all these animals die straight away, or were they simply in the path of the flames? What happened? At the time, there was very little monitoring of the forest estate, so it was hard to give a definitive answer. But there have been a number of studies and reviews since the fires have passed, after they went out in March 2020, that have provided some insights into this. Many animals, as expected, perished very quickly. So the mobs of kangaroos that Greg mentioned just now, clearly there were some immediate casualties of the flames. But a very large cohort of animals would have survived the immediate path of the flames only to have succumbed soon afterwards. If you managed to get underground or find a deep hollow in a tree that didn't burn too completely, then you might emerge afterwards having escaped. You might have smoke inhalation, you might have sustained some fire injuries. But you'd emerge into a charred landscape with no food, with no water, no shelter, no other resources, no social structure for the other animals in whose populations you were at one time a component. And you'd face the inevitable problem of the feral cats, the foxes, the dogs that come in soon after the fire. It's really a playground for these opportunistic predators. So most survivors would have succumbed quickly under these conditions, with perhaps a lucky few being rescued from the ashes by the army of selfless volunteers that moved in quickly to try to salvage the best from these conditions, to carry out rescues and to rehabilitate as far as possible. Certainly, walking into a severely burnt forest after the event was like walking into a morgue. Everything was black, there was no sound, nothing moving. Rachel Carson, some years ago, wrote a book called Silent Spring to describe the decline of birdsong in the US. We had a silent autumn after the fires were out. We had a silent winter, and then we had our own silent spring in 2020. Well, this is quite bleak. I'd like to conclude on a slightly more positive note, a brief epilogue. The fires did kickstart a lot of monitoring in the forest estate so that we know a lot more about what's going on in the forest environment now. And many of the species for which we held particularly grave fears have actually rebounded quite well. One great example is the Kangaroo Island dunnart. If you visited the western end of Kangaroo Island post-fire, it was an awful spectacle. There were a few sticks standing up above the ashes, and that was it. But the Kangaroo Island dunnart somehow found refuge and have been bouncing back. In parts of the Blue Mountains now, not all, but in some parts, kangaroos and wallabies and even lyrebirds are coming back. We've learnt a lot of lessons about which animals are most at risk in the future fires and what we need to do to reduce the likelihood of these fires taking place again and to reduce the impacts. And I think we've woken up to some extent to the dangers of escalating climate change. And we're moving slowly to mitigate them. Of course, more mega fires will occur in the future. Our challenge now is to heed them, to heal country, and to move on from the tragic black summer bushfires that we've gathered here today to remember. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. I'd now like to welcome Ray Harvey. She's a volunteer wildlife carer with Wildlife Rescue South Coast. She founded Wild to Free Kangaroo Sanctuary in 2016 in the Mogo State Forest near Bateman's Bay. Ray. Do we have a Ray? We've got a Ray. Thank you.
I'm not a public speaker, so you'll have to forgive me. I'm just a lowly wildlife carer, very much affected by Greg's words when he spoke about Bateman's Bay and what it was like there, because I was right in there. Sorry, I've just lost my words. Here we go. So New Year's Eve that Greg spoke about was the night that I also lost my home and car. But Wild to Free lost everything, my charity, except for a shipping container full of animal food, which kept many animals alive in the Mogo State Forest in the weeks that followed. We were one of over 1,000 homes destroyed that night on Yuin country on the south coast, and we were left with no power or water for many weeks, but we remained on site to help the survivors. I didn't care about my loss. I had insurance. We have hospitals, we have psychologists, government and organisational support. Our wildlife don't have that. They lost their homes and they had nothing. They had no one to help them. They're the victims of this fire, not people like me. That fire was so intense that the wildlife couldn't outrun it, and even if they did, where could they go when the fire's everywhere all at once? We were trapped on the property, but I live on the Clyde River, I mean, it's because of that river that I'm alive today, thanks to being rescued on a boat. We lost 2/3 of the wild and hand-raised kangaroos that night, and most of the possums and gliders too. He was right, everybody's right, it was completely silent for many, many months. Some of our resident birds survived, but the glossy black cockatoos were forced out of the area because they almost exclusively feed on the she-oak seeds, and the she-oaks will not be back for many, many years. None of them survived that intensity. Just months after the fire, the government increased the quota of kangaroos commercially killed in the wild for dog food and leather. And I just hope that in my lifetime we can educate people on how this horrific killing affects the mob structure and emotions of our very, very misunderstood kangaroos. Shooting the prize alpha male while he stands tall to protect his mob completely destroys that entire mob structure. And I know that this is about Black Summer, it's not about commercial killing, but I will never speak in public without mentioning it because it's that important. Once that alpha is shot, the young bucks begin fighting and causing trouble, leading to myopathy and other stress-related deaths on the females. The shooters ripping joeys from their pouch and bashing their heads against the ute bumper bar. What is this barbaric behaviour? We are in the 15th century. Only 24% of kangaroos make it to adulthood in the wild, and just 6% of kangaroos rescued in New South Wales survive long enough to be released. So it's no wonder that many wildlife carers stop caring for kangaroos. As I'm sure Dr. Howard Ralph will explain later, they are heartbreakers. They die very, very easily. They form incredible emotional bonds with their carers, and because of that fragility, a small amount of stress can kill them. Losing one of their friends can kill them. So let's now increase that stress tenfold into the killing fields and think about the number of kangaroos dying from the trauma of losing others in their mob. The stress of the chasing and the dogs and the humans and the spotlights and the gunfire. Their peaceful lives becoming a nightly war zone. No animal or human should have to live with the fear of losing their loved ones and their family night after night after night. I know the impact of that trauma from raising shooting orphans myself and from losing some of our kangaroos in that bushfire. Babies that I had hand-raised, bottle-fed around the clock and nursed back to health from injury or illness. My babies, my family. I don't have time today to share all their stories, but I do want to share a couple in hope that it helps even one person out there today realise that kangaroos are not the pests that the farmers want you to think they are. The non-native animals are the ones doing the damage. Kangaroos are not a commercial commodity. They are sentient beings with better communication skills than the smartest dogs on the planet. And yet here we are turning our native animals into dog food. Kangaroos are a national treasure, and we need to pay much more respect to our First Nation animals. We need to respect kangaroos like Marion. I recall the one and only time Marion lost her daughter Lucy. It was early in the morning, and I had a young Joey in a carry bag, and I was about to go on a bushwalk when Marion suddenly raced up to me with her eyes wide with fright and without her daughter. She wanted me to open my bag so she could look inside and confirm that I hadn't stolen her daughter. After she confirmed the Joey wasn't hers, she raced off loudly, calling as she bounded across the paddocks, calling and calling louder and louder in absolute distress for her lost daughter. There was nothing we could do but wait and hope that she would find her hiding in the bush somewhere that day. As dusk approached and the roos began returning, we waited with bated breath, but she came home alone. About 30 minutes later, I watched Auntie Pocket hop home, and right beside her was naughty little Lucy, casually hopping like nothing was wrong. Apparently Auntie Pocket had been Joey sitting Lucy all day. And then I saw something I'd never seen before. I watched Marion physically slap her daughter across the head with her paw, which is pretty funny when you think about how short their arms are. She then let Lucy take a long drink of milk from the teat in her pouch, and all was well again. And I will never forget the despair I saw in her eyes that morning, and she was the most incredible and devoted mother. She was the first kangaroo I knew we'd lost. I knew because her two wild-born children, Lucy and Malu, despite being very wary of us, had made their way to where the house once stood, where we were providing food and water. And I knew the moment I saw them both without their mother for the first time, that she hadn't made it I can just imagine Marion throwing herself in front of her babies to protect them, and I don't doubt that she gave her life to save theirs. They're both still alive and happy on the property today. But Marion never did come back. Heidi had just gone off the bottle and had been soft-released a couple of months before the fire. She got her name because she was always hiding in her pouch when she first arrived. Losing your mother and finding yourself being cared for by a predator is a very traumatic thing. It took almost 2 weeks to gain her trust. After that, she loved nothing more than gently suckling while having her face stroked. Her other favourite activity as she got older was to practice her kicking skills on us, which joeys often do with their mothers, but every time Heidi did it, she would make this super loud snorting noise every time her feet went down on the ground, and giving me fits of laughter. She was a very, very special kangaroo to me. You see, they all have very unique personalities, so you end up having this unique and different relationship with every single one of these kangaroos that we slaughter for dog food. They're all unique and they all have personalities, and you do form very close child and mother-like relationships with them. And Heidi was one of those. She was my daughter, she was my baby. And she was a juvenile when she lost her life. And I have to live with that guilt every day, knowing that if I had said, no, I can't take her, maybe she'd still be alive. But I took her in as an orphan, and now she's dead because she died in Black Summer on my property. It's taken a long time for me to acknowledge that none of these kangaroos are coming home, and that I never found their bodies because the fire was so hot that it melted metal, and that their bodies were actually disintegrated so much that not even a bone was left behind to find. Stormy gave me a bird's eye view of what a mother does as a joey grows when she returned to us from the bush to raise her firstborn in early 2019. She felt safer living outside the house 24/7, so I got the unique privilege of watching her joey Sabina hop and play for the first time and see exactly how a wild-born joey is reared up close by a real mother. And I can never thank Stormy enough for those lessons in joey care. Because of that time she spent living close to the house, I was absolutely convinced that Stormy would be one of the survivors, but she wasn't. She never returned home after that night, and neither did her daughter Sabina. Over the days to follow, a total of 26 kangaroos did return, and I know that we only have that many because of the mangroves and the tide being in when the fire hit. 26 kangaroos beat the fire and made their way to the water in time, many burning their paws and feet on the hot ground as they exited in the days and hours to follow. The trees continued to burn and small fires continued to break out in places until late February. I'm haunted by the image of Yogi and watching him come up towards the house. He was so shocked when he saw the destruction that he stumbled back down, and I never ever saw him again. Did he fall into the river and drown? I don't know. We did a search and rescue, but we never found his body or any bodies. There was no bodies left of any animal anywhere. There was nothing but ash. For a long time, I got through that disaster by telling me they'd all eventually make their way home, just like Kiri did. She returned on January the 10th without a scratch. She assessed the situation, took an almond and a drink of water, and took off. She returned the following day with both her daughters in perfect condition. Where she went, I don't know. All three remain at Wild Free today, perfectly healthy and happy. I thought there would be more like Kiri in the days to follow, but they didn't come. We got to know the wild survivors, the possums, the birds, everything that survived relied on the food and water, because without us they would have all starved. We were the vacuum of the Mogo State Forest, bringing in everything that survived just to keep alive. I can't name all the wild kangaroos who died that night, or the other wildlife, and nor can I read out 3 billion names to acknowledge every single animal like they should be who died that in the Black Summer bushfires. What I can do for the first time since this disaster is finally acknowledge out loud the loss of some very special kangaroos who died in the Black Summer bushfires where I live, the ones I cared for. And I beg you to please remember that to me and every other wildlife carer out there, these animals are our children. So please remember Angel, Autumn and her daughter Summer, Boris, big fat Bugsy who ate way too much, Clover's pouch joey that she was forced to euthanise to recover from her own injuries, Heidi, Honey's daughter Bee, who had to be euthanized by a vet after the fire, Lily's daughter Holly, Marion, Mars, Melvin, Mikey Potato, Pluto, Rufus, Storm and Sabina, Yogi, the redneck wallabies, Jude and Jarrah, and along with every other redneck wallaby on the property. It's been over 3 years since I've seen a redneck. They're gone forever, I think. The hand-raised kangaroos who finally returned to the wild and left the property only to likely to have perished in the utterly decimated Mogo State Forest. And in closing, I would like to acknowledge 2 kangaroos in particular who stepped up to support their mob in the aftermath. I would like to thank our alpha male Kangaroo, who protected the injured Clover and Cricket for months while they healed from their injuries. And I would like to thank Lily, who took on Clover's son Clyde and raised that boy as her own after losing our own firstborn Holly in the fire. Holly and 3 billion other individual personalities, sons, aunties, fathers, sisters, perished, remembered and acknowledged here today, and I hope never ever forgotten. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ray. Ray has come up from the South Coast to share that story with us and to share the names of those she lost. Next, we have Evan Quatermain. He's the Head of Programs and Disaster Response at Humane Society International. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Just before I get going, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, the Gadigal people, and thank Peter and the Jannawi Dance Clan for their warm welcome just earlier. Trying to think about the Black Summer bushfires from a First Nations perspective of caring for country and careful stewardship and custodianship of land, I think that it just makes the disrespect towards and the mismanagement of nature that we've overseen for the last few hundred years just all the more shameful. Black Summer had been going for several weeks in New South Wales and elsewhere in the country before it became a deeply personal experience for me in the first week of January as I approached Kangaroo Island with my CEO and some of our American disaster response specialists. It was a very ominous approach on the last ferry over that was taking any non-military or agency personnel. So we were on this ferry with army tanks and all sorts around us, approaching this huge plume of black smoke coming off Kangaroo Island. It was a very surreal experience that only became more so when we actually got there, and immediately as we're entering these burned out plantations on the side of the road, seeing every 5 metres or so the body of a dead koala or kangaroo, often mothers and young that had died together, and everywhere we saw just low down on the branches, injured koalas that had suffered from burns and were clearly terrified and often seeking help, even with things like water and stuff like that we were able to put on the ground, and they were coming down for it. Quite desperate, because even at that stage they'd been out there for days dealing with the aftermath of what, the traumatic experience that they had gone through when the flames came through. So I guess our first sort of feeling was, where is everyone? That, if we were alone in these forests and, we weren't requested there or ordered there, we were just there, and if we weren't, then people wouldn't even know what we were seeing, basically. And I'm sure that's a really common feeling of exasperation that wildlife carers face all the time. Some of the scenes that we witnessed were confronting. I mean, it's almost impossible to imagine the severity of the flames that went through those plantations. The oils in those blue gum eucalypt plantations on Kangaroo Island is so volatile, and with the winds and the conditions that were experienced, it would have just been an absolute fireball. I mean, we've heard 80 metres high flames from locals and stories like that. So it just ripped across the landscape, and we could see that. There were entire mobs of tamar wallabies that were gradually dead further and further away from the edge of the forest that they'd clearly been trying to dart from. And these are very small, swift animals that you would think had the best chance of survival out of anyone. And then those that made it that bit further then entangled in fences and burned there. Groups of wildlife together in clearings where they'd obviously sought safety from the plantations that they were in and had all gone into the one direction to die together. There were wallabies and kangaroos, larger birds, possums, goannas, all of these bodies together in a clearing, and you just can't imagine these animals mingling at all, and the scenes of obvious panic at the time would have been shocking. Even seeing the burned possums, small roadside fires were still going, really small in comparison to what actually had happened previously, but even in those small fires you could see that animals aren't super equipped at escaping them. So we had possums and other things that were just crawling out on fire. And all we could do was grab many of them and take them back to the wildlife park where operations were happening, usually in the knowledge that we weren't saving lives, that we were trying to minimise suffering, that we were just taking them there because in some cases there were animals that had been out there for weeks on the ground, kangaroos that looked okay, and then you got closer and their feet were just bones with maggots crawling on them. Defeated koalas huddling on the ground. You couldn't even tell they were koalas at first. You would be looking and your eyes would trick you because there's the heat then. There were 43-degree days, super dry and windy with rippling heat coming off the ground, and you could see this, what looked like a boulder, but it's a koala cuddled up on the ground, just in the middle of a clearing, just defeated and waiting to die. And even seemingly untouched flocks of small birds all on the ground together, hundreds of them dead, that the only plausible explanation we could come up with was that they were there when the fire went through and that the oxygen was just sucked from the air and they asphyxiated most likely while flying. And then there were animals that we thought were dead too but weren't, and I think they were always the hardest when you'd be scouring the ground, and that you have to look at all of the bodies quite closely to make sure, and sometimes a koala that you were sure was a dead body would lift its head up and look at you, and then you just hustled as much as you could to get it back to the wildlife park where it went in a pit with so many others. And then Greg as well, his comment on the silence of the place, it was very unnerving to see a place like Kangaroo Island, which is so abundant and diverse, just absolutely deathly silent. And I guess that ever-present knowledge we had as well that what we were seeing was just but a microcosm of what was going on everywhere. Kangaroo Island is an incredible place, but it's only a small place compared to the scale of the devastation that was sweeping all across the country at that time. And we knew that we were people doing that there, but that there were thousands of others all across the country doing the same thing, doing those black walks, looking for animals, and just doing all they could to help in that desperate situation. And then it as Chris mentioned, the situation evolved. There was that immediate need to get animals as fast as possible, and then weeks later we were still there seeking out patches of green among the plantations where any survivors were flocking to and trying to get them out of there, down from the trees and out of there before they ate through those small patches of green that remained, because koalas eat a lot, and when there's a lot of them clashing and fighting each other for what's there, we just knew that we had to get them out there to be rehomed. And in many of cases, at least those ones we knew did have a future if we could get them out of their bad situations fast enough. what we saw was that there was a real community effort down on Kangaroo Island, and I think everywhere across Australia. But one thing that we noticed straight away was that agencies that previously lent on each other in these situations couldn't anymore. There was, New South Wales Fire Service may help out in South Australia or Victoria. We even have international water bombers come across from America. The full support was never available because everybody was busy and having to deal with their own patch before they could help one another. So the capacity just wasn't there for lending a hand. And as climate change impacts, they're hitting now, that was obvious there. But we know that these patterns in the fire seasons that are lengthening all over the world, as Greg was talking about, that how everything's just so out of whack, that situation is just going to get worse. So we all need to, I suppose, build our own ability to respond and that capacity to help when the going gets tough, because help may not be able to come externally. So we knew that we had to do more, and we started out with a report called Safeguarding Australia's Wildlife that talked to wildlife carers all around the country about their experience to see if they went through the same thing we did. And the findings were quite common sense. We were woefully unprepared, and we have such a reliance on volunteers. And if that is to continue, the finding was that we need so much more support. If we're going to rely on caring people who, I think by their very nature, feel the impacts of all of this so much more, because we just heard from Ray how much these individual animals and the connection wildlife carers have to them. If we're going to rely on people like that who are so incredible but fragile in a way that they know the reality, we need to at least be resourcing them. We need to be giving them the mental health support, and we need to make it so that they're connected and not alone out there just dealing with the immensity of the world in that moment. So our first response was to try and help at HSI these wildlife carers get back on their feet in many cases. So many people lost all of their facilities and their ability to keep on helping the animals that were already overwhelming them from years of drought and everything else that happens with road strikes and all these other impacts that we have on animals. And then just to do all we could to build their capacity so that the inevitable next time this happens, we can help more things. Because it's all about preparedness and empowering people, because I think that the unfortunate reality is what we're facing is beyond what we can expect authorities to be ready for at this point in time. And that external help can be slow, it can be temporary, and it relies on that local support anyway. So it all comes down to prepared communities and empowering the people out there who are doing the work that their hearts tell them has to be done. So what we went through as a nation, all of that human and animal suffering, it just can't be in vain. I think that the sacrifice was too great. The numbers are unfathomable. And we know that each of those numbers was an animal with a personality that had ongoing suffering and ongoing impacts. It's not just about death, it's about all of that pain that they went through and caring about that too. I think it's that complacency got us here, that unpreparedness, and it can't continue, though I fear it has somewhat in those years that have come since, with COVID hitting so soon after Black Summer fires, and then the inevitable churn of the news cycle. People forget. But we're here today not forgetting. So thank you all for caring and for the support in person and online today, because we need big hearts and all hands on deck to make the difference that we have to. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Evan. Now, we're running behind on time, and the church has very kindly lent us this building on Palm Sunday. So we're going to have a really breath of a break, and Barry is going to come and play for us while, if anyone needs to stretch their legs, there's an ambulant bathroom in that back corner, or there's ladies and men's if you just go out of this building, just around there. And then we'll rejoin with Jannawi Dance Clan again. Thank you. Thank you so much, Barry. And that was actually a newer tune called McMoggy's Lament, which was composed by a group on Facebook called Old Geezers Learning the Bagpipes or something like that. And I chose that rather than a more classic tune because just to give a nod to the fact that this tragedy is global. People around the world are mourning the loss of their non-human countrymen. Thank you, and throwing it back to Jannawi Dance Clan.
Hi everyone, we're going to now dance two dances. One is Baradawee and the eel dance, and then we're going to dance Colby, the sea eagle. And Colby and Baradawee travel from the mountains to the sea, from the fresh water to the salt water, and also on land. So they travel in the sky, it's the eagle, on land, and then the eel, Baradawee. And my grandson's named after Colby, the sea eagle. Hey.
Guyama, Barmara, Durban. Gurugal, Gurugal, Baradui, Bugiria. Gurugal, Gurugal, Baradui, Bugiria. Minimanangara, Yaranganga, Daragun, Daragun. Minimanangara, Yaranganga, Daragun, Daragun. Navaradoi, Anavu, Bamavanga, Bawaga. Navaradoi, Anavu, Bamavanga, Bawaga. Arawan, Gari, Garen, Nabuki, Nabuki. Walamaban, Alawa, Tarangulu, Tarangulu. Arawan, Gari, Garen, Nabuki, Nabuki. Walamaban, Alawa, Tarangulu, Tarangulu. Kubi kubi dabwa mili barang kubu mari kubi. 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 Lamra barwata bai muli. Kubi kubi dabwa mili barang kubu mari kubi. Nana umra barua kawai muli. Ae, ae, go.
Next up, we have Danielle Sellermeyer. She's the Deputy Director of the Sydney Environment Institute and the leader of the Multi-Species Justice Project at the University of Sydney and the author of Summertime. Danielle. Yeah, please welcome Danielle.
Thank you, Annika, for organising this, and I also want to acknowledge that I am on the unceded lands of the Gadigal people. So Annika asked me to speak about a different class of animals who didn't get counted in the 3 billion and who we refer to as livestock, even those of us who are well-intentioned. So some years ago, I received an email asking if I could offer a home to Jimmy and Kate. They had been swept off the factory floor as wastage pigs when they were babies. And 4 years later, their first human who had loved them was no longer able to keep them. We'd never lived with pigs, but we thought we'd give it a go. And in the next few years, they became our family. On the weekend, I would take a book and a bottle of water and a blanket, and I would go down and practice my new methodology of reading with Katie, with my head against her body. Fast forward to December 2019, and the fires are getting close. It's clear that our plan to clear the paddocks, to open the gates, and to let the animals fend for themselves when the fires came was completely inadequate to deal with these fires. We had heard stories of farmed and domesticated animals dead in paddocks when the oxygen had been sucked out when the fires surrounded. So I phoned Em, who had been their first human, and she said that she was expecting my call and arrived the next day to take Jimmy and Kate there to a place that at that time was safe. Only that place was Cobargo. And on the morning of the 31st of December, as I was standing in my empty home, evacuated, with all the animals, apart from the wild animals, all the farmed and domesticated animals gone, my phone rang and it was Em's voice, and she said, "It's all gone." Katie's body was dead by the burnt out house, and Jimmy, who had not yet been found, was presumably lying somewhere else on the land, dead. But 24 hours later, I received a text from Em saying, "I found Jimmy." I presumed Jimmy's body, but then that was followed by a granular video of him running black-faced towards the camera with Em's voice saying, "I know, I know." When Katie was killed, my relationship with the climate catastrophe completely changed. I thought I knew about it, this is what I worked on. But suddenly it went from being something that was going to happen sometime else to someone else, somewhere else, to it was happening here, now, and to us. But it was what happened when Jimmy came home that really transformed my understanding of what is going on. At first, Jimmy was clearly relieved to come home. He ate and he drank and he placed his huge hot body in the mud. But then he stopped. I think that the acute terror had passed and he was able to be present to what had happened, to his own trauma, and to the reality that the person, his sister, with whom he had spent every day of his life, was no longer there in their home. Over the next few days, he didn't eat, he barely drank, and he took himself deep into his world where he had built himself spaces in the cool of the earth where he could hear the river and listen to the birds. What I witnessed was not only the enormity and complexity of his emotions, but the wisdom that he was bringing to working his way through this trauma and deciding whether he was going to go on. He was making sense in his own way of the terror and the loss, and he was making decisions. Jimmy wasn't just a victim of the fires, an object of climate catastrophe. He was a subject, a someone with complex emotions and responses, a someone whose way of making sense of the world had been shattered and whose relationships had been devastated. I know this is true about Jimmy because we lived through that period together, holding each other and trying to forge a path into the future. But it's not just true of Jimmy, it's true of all of them. I'd like to say 3 billion of all of them, the number of which Chris spoke and which he worked out, but 3 billion doesn't include the farmed and domesticated animals who were killed. It doesn't include them because no one counted them, except as the economic losses for farmers. So how do we presence the killing of all those animals? How do we mark their lives in a way that honours and respects them, given that they did not give us permission to be here and they cannot tell their own stories? How do we simultaneously capture the inconceivable scale of the killing and make present for ourselves the specificity of their lives? And I want to thank Ray for doing that so beautifully. Not that 3 billion plus animals were killed, but that one animal was killed, and that happened over 3 billion times. How do we capture the moral gravity and the moral meaning of their deaths? How do we commemorate them in a way that correctly attributes moral, legal, and political responsibility, and that holds those who are responsible accountable for their killing? Those are tough asks, but if we are to remember them not only ethically, but responsibly and politically, we have to meet those asks. As a starting point, and I think we have seen this so beautifully today, we need to remember them with moral imagination and with embodied connection. But we also need to remember them with a clear-eyed analysis of the abusive, extractive, violent, and unjust systems, practices, policies, and laws that enabled and caused their killing. We have to narrate their deaths not as a tragedy, but as a grave form of injustice. Not only did they contribute nothing to this climate catastrophe, but they are the double victims of the structures and systems that are driving it. Fossil fuel development, deforestation, industrial animal agriculture, and they are on the front lines of its impact. So did this principle of climate justice shape how the state responded to the threats that they faced or the harms that they experienced? On both counts, the answer is a resounding no. From the state, no protection and no succour. By contrast, as we have heard today, ordinary people, the people who shared their lives with these animals, were everywhere to be seen. They rescued animals, they transported them, they offered them safe shelter, they fed them, and in the aftermath, they went out and put out food and water for those who survived. Because they recognised that we owe other animals a duty of care in the face of climate-driven disasters that are the result of the industrial capitalist colonial system that has come to be normalised as the form of human life in this country. So I would like to see this commemoration be a call to arms, not to military ones, but to caring and just ones. As we prepare to meet the future climate-driven disasters, and there will be climate-driven disasters, let us draw on this collective grief and this collective fury to insist that climate justice, which we know must be the underlying principle of the response to the climate catastrophe, that climate justice includes the other animals with whom we share this earth. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Danielle. And yeah, it was really hard to find someone who could speak for the animals used as livestock. They've had not only their lives, but their bodies colonized by extractive capitalism, but they deserve to be free, and one day they will be. Animal liberation. Next up, we have the legendary wildlife veterinarian, Dr. and anaesthetist, Dr. Howard Ralph. He's come up from the Southern Tablelands. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for the invitation to speak here today. I think it's a critically important matter because we've all witnessed, all of us have been involved in some way or another in the process of this catastrophe that's beset us. And we've had a look at the external focus of all of this and climate change and many of the causes that occur. But the thing that occurs to me at the conclusion of a lot of this is that people say to me, living with wombats is difficult. I say, yes, but living without them is even more difficult. So they've gone from the large areas and include all the other wild critters. So I'm going to take a different focus to the other speakers today and talk about the individual, knowing that individuals make up communities. And what we try to do as a veterinary surgeon, having been intimately involved in the extreme pain and suffering that these critters have undertaken, many species, or all species basically, associated with the fires. And this is terribly distressing because I have a very close contact with my patients and I feel very strongly about their welfare and I empathise with them as well as I can, being of a different species, but sometimes I'm torn between which species to be. But whatever happened and whatever we witnessed will never be forgotten. It was so awful, we will never forget it. And the fact of the burns was a harbinger to all of the other horrors that took place. People have mentioned at the time when the burns occurred, but later on, for many, many months and even years later, we have the effect on the environment and the habitat and so on. But the effect on the individual at the time of the burning is not just the burns, but they got a whole list of things which could go on for several pages, like inhalational trauma, panic reaction, aspiration pneumonia, hyperactivity, fight or flight, running into cars, running into all sorts of objects on the ground. Exhaustion, particularly stress in wildlife, is the killer. And that's all wildlife. While some are worse off than others, the fact is that stress is the big killer. And this sort of event, whether it be immediately with the fire burning and fleeing from the fire, or later on having run into a fence or something, then the stress goes on. They had dehydration, they lost their habitat, their social order was disrupted, some were asphyxiated, and that's probably a blessing to those who were ahead of the fire, because by the time they were burnt, they were dead. And I think that's probably a blessing, even though we don't like to look at it. They suffered mental and physical trauma, and particularly those that did survive that we got to see and treat later on. Many of them had other matters such as multiple fractures, having run into things, hit by cars and so on. They got pneumonia, a lot were blind, their eyes were burnt out and coagulated, they couldn't see. Someone mentioned myopathy, which is devastating, particularly for eastern grey kangaroos, and so it went on. Renal failure and ultimately violent death, and that's not fair. Anyway, they suffered a lot of pain and suffering, and the massive loss of wildlife, the numbers were enormous and catastrophic, and it was an absolute tragedy with the habitat loss and the impact that was felt not only then, but the genetic loss, which will be felt for a long time to come, and may only become apparent when we see their ability to be competent or incompetent when it comes to survival. And we know that wildlife, particularly under stress, their immune system suffers accordingly and they tend to become much more susceptible to everything else adverse than other species, including ourselves. The appropriate treatment of survivors we regard as important, and we're treating a lot of individuals who make up a community. We help to modify some of the negative aspects both to the individual and to the community and to the environment. We have a hospital, Southern Cross Wildlife Hospital, Southern Cross Wildlife Care, which is devoted to wildlife, although we do treat anybody that turns up in a storm. And we went on many field trips to areas where there were fires burning down the south coast in Sydney, Victoria some time ago, Eastern Creek, Coonabarabran, Blue Mountain, Southern Tableland, etc. So we spread ourselves far and wide with the available volunteers that we had, and at the same time trying to run the hospital for those survivors that got to us for further treatment. We've had extensive experience in burns management because of all these fires that we've attended over the years. We also have, some of us, a lot of experience in human burn management. And the fact is that when you look at the pathology of all of this, the change that occurs in the body and the impact of fires is very much the same over all species. So we can take whatever information there is to manage these things in the best way. We're a wildlife-focused medical service, so we're aware of the many problems that go with wildlife care, and particularly that of stress. I've mentioned that already, but it's the big deal, and it's something that is ever present for all wildlife whenever they're in contact with us or other predators. They're particularly susceptible, and as I mentioned, kangaroos, eastern grey kangaroos are the worst. They're the classic case of where stress can be immediately fatal. They're chased on a motorbike or suffer a fire coming towards them or whatever, and with a wound or any other stressor added to that, they suddenly drop dead because they've got cardiomyopathy from part of the stress reaction. This is very common. We see it every day, and we see it not just with bushfire attention, but we see it with a lot of other things that are happening with wildlife. So stress is the big deal, and a lot of other stressors that occurred at the time were any injury. And one that was distressing was their close contact with ourselves, with human primates, and particularly when they were in a situation where there was a lot of noise, people were shouting, maybe unnecessarily. There was a lot of media attention with bright lights flashing and videos running and people running here and there and shouting and do this and do that. And that is particularly stressful for wildlife. And they paid the price accordingly. And that's not fair either. So close proximity to us and predators. Injudicious capture was another thing, and inappropriate, adequate nutrition after the effect. They didn't receive, in some cases, enough sedation to provide relief of their terrible anxiety, and that sort of treatment is available. People just have to be aware of it. Some died from hypoxia, others had ongoing problem with their lungs for a long period of time. We offered clinical care to any patient that came our way, whether it be in the field or at the hospital, and we offered clinical veterinary advice to people who would be interested in it, including in-hospital management if they were able to access us. Some wildlife carers, veterinarians and rescuers accepted our contribution willingly and were grateful to do that, and have many lectures from myself and others about what to do in this field, devastating situation. Unfortunately, acknowledging all the difficulties at the time, there were some others who, for whatever reason, failed to or refused to accept our help. And I don't quite understand that, but it was something that stuck in our mind all the time, because there were situations where we could have helped but were not allowed or invited to do so. And I think that's a tragedy. There were incidents of patients being subjected to, as I said, lots of noise and lots of people and activity and bright lights and flashing lights and noisy things happening and handling problems and so on, etc. All of this mitigated against their survival and increases their likelihood of coming unstuck with some other condition that was present at the time. There were also a lot of incidents of critters and patients not receiving adequate treatment, which we think is adequate treatment, but there was a lot of what I see as unnecessary killing. And that should not have happened, because the facilities were there, the advice was there, but some people chose to ignore it. And as I said, I understand it was a terribly difficult time and people were stressed, and maybe they overlooked that and the fact that we were available. But I hope that next time there's a catastrophe like this, that people will take advice from places that offer it and be aware that things can be done that should have been done that were not done. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ralph. And we just got one final speaker, very special, Sonia Elwood. She's been a wildlife carer for over 35 years. She's the Vice Chair of the New South Wales Wildlife Council. Thank you so much, Sonia.
Good afternoon, everyone. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Gadigal people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and future. I'm going to try and squeeze this down a little bit because I know we're over time, but the one thing I really do want to say is I want to thank all the wildlife carers, vets and animal welfare organisations that gave so much to our wildlife during the fires, and especially those that were part of my journey in that horrible period. The fires for me were, I kind of watched what happened in northern New South Wales and that through August and September, and at the end of those fires, I just had that feeling in my gut like, I couldn't shake it. And almost immediately in October, fires broke out on the south coast and Blue Mountains almost simultaneously. And over the weeks, that feeling of dread and that tightening in my chest that something really, really terrible was happening, I just couldn't shake it. I spent weeks up until Christmas trying to coordinate across the New South Wales Wildlife Council network has about 4,500 carers. We're an entirely voluntary sector, so no staff, so all these extra jobs, wildlife carers are doing them as well. And I could see by early December that our network was really breaking down, particularly on the south coast. Communication lines were disappearing, power was being lost, internet was being lost, carers were being evacuated, displaced, properties were burnt out, homes were burnt out. And my worst fear was realised in the wee hours of the 1st of January, so New Year's Eve keeps coming up, I notice. We're 2 carers in our network. I was notified that they'd almost lost their lives defending their home and their wildlife, and they were in critical condition. And it was at that moment for me that it's the oddest thing, really. I actually I'm going to do it now. I actually really breathed out, and I realised I'd been holding my breath for weeks and weeks, and at that point I really wasn't getting a lot of sleep. I'd been working 24/7 for a number of weeks and just grabbing sleep when I could. But it was at that moment I knew I had to actually get out and do something. Wildlife carers are called first responders. Well, to me they're kind of like the only responders, because if wildlife carers don't go out there, who's going to go out there for the wildlife? And who's going to come after them when they're in trouble? So I just, and I feel a lot of the people in my position, who are executives in their own branches or in their own organisations, we feel a real responsibility towards our carers, and we're not all related by blood, but we're related by belief. So I, with permission of the Wildlife Council Executive, engaged 3 international animal rescue organisations. Wildlife at that time were not part of the state emergency response framework, so how were we going to set up triage areas? What were we going to do? And moving into an area where it was completely burned out. So off I went with absolutely no plan. I'd been approached by these groups for some weeks, and I said to them, don't have any money because the Wildlife Council is an entirely voluntary network. Don't have a plan, but if you've been at me for weeks, if you want to come and let's see what we can do, let's go. At the very same time, within my own group, a really visionary project was coming to fruition. that had been worked on by 2 very dedicated wildlife carers for 3 or 4 years, and the universe obviously knew, but the mobile triage clinic came off the production line in the last week of December. So that was hurriedly stocked, and with a complement of very experienced wildlife vets, headed off in the first week of January. So all of that sort of happened simultaneously with the things that I was doing, and we headed down to the south coast. To cut a long story short, we managed to set up 4 field triage centres for injured wildlife. As I left Sydney, I put out a media release to the community down there to try and let them know what we were doing. And the community really responded. The general public were just so on board. And I've heard people talk about black walks, and I've heard people talk about armies of volunteers, and I'd really like to say that wasn't the case. There's only, between the Wildlife Council network and the WIRES network, there's only about 7,500 carers, and 80% of them were in the fire zone. So 80% of them were evacuated, displaced, had no power, had watched the wildlife on their properties, many of them perish. So at a time where, really they had every right to just sit down in despair and shock and horror and trauma, and they really didn't. Saw such bravery and courage and resilience, and so despite the fact that our efforts really were just a drop in the ocean of what was needed, it really shows that it can be done. And I'm very happy to say that we are now, and have since the fire's been working with government to make sure that wildlife are included in the emergency response framework, and sanctuaries are being rebuilt better, bigger and better, and wildlife veterinary expertise is slowly being expanded. There's a lot of work to be done. We'd like to see mobile clinics in regional areas right across the nation, really, well, wherever there are concentrations of wildlife, and regional veterinary practices for wildlife. So I was really scrambling at times to get in hold of vets, veterinary supplies, builders, because there was no infrastructure to hold these animals that were coming in. So we need to really get prepared in the future, but I do believe that will come. And I believe it'll be wildlife carers that will probably drive that. Today, the other thing I really wanted to say is it's really about not the animals that we were able to help, and as I said, that was just a drop in the ocean compared to those that were lost. And as wildlife carers, we really have this deep intrinsic belief that these animals have a right to be in this world. Their very presence enhances our lives, and they bring us joy. It really hurts when we know they're out there hurting, and we are afraid when we know they are afraid, and it physically pains us in our hearts when we know they're suffering. The 3 billion animals that died in the Black Summer fires will live on in our hearts and memories, and we are reminded of them all the time. We're reminded of them when we're rescuing and caring. We're reminded of them at odd times in the dead of night, tending to an animal or feeding a joey. We're reminded by the smell of hazard reduction burns and bushfires, old photos, Facebook memories, and particularly when we visit wild places and the animals are no longer there and the forests are silent. As wildlife carers, we carry this grief individually, but today we mourn collectively, and we are really, really sorry. As we see more climate-related disasters unfolding, like the flooding we've seen in recent months, we know we have to do better, and we have to dig deeper. And as I said, I think some of the facilities I've spoken about and being included in the emergency response framework is an enormous step. So to close, I would like to ask everyone listening today, and all of those of you here, to please make a pledge, do something for wildlife, the remaining wildlife in your life, and do it to honour those animals that were lost and to remember them. It doesn't have to be anything huge. It can be really simple. Planting native plants in your own garden, joining a local bush care or land care group to restore habitat, and as we move now from La Nina into El Nino, put out some water stations. They're just so important and honestly can save a little life out there. I pledged 3 years ago that I would never stop working to make sure that wildlife were included in the state emergency response framework, and I have continued with that work, and I won't stop until it's done. And I know, on behalf of all wildlife carers out there, I know we all pledge that we're always going to go for the wildlife. So if there's ever a disaster, you're going to find us there. So please think about your own pledges as we leave this event today, and I've condensed that right down. So thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much, Sonia. And so many people have had to speak about really painful things to share with us today for the public good. Finally, I just want to say that, while I was planning the vigil, Orion the hunter was high in the sky for all of those weeks. And on Friday night, I saw a familiar face, Antares, the heart of the scorpion. If you look at that, the Department of Animals, the sign is the constellation of Scorpius. And the reason for that is that in ancient Greece, Orion the hunter was the best of all mortal men in hunting. He hunted with the gods, and he needed a new way to prove how good at hunting he was. And so he said, my next feat will be to kill all the animals on Earth. Gaia, Mother Earth, said, well, we need to get rid of this guy. So she asked a scorpion to go and kill him, not a god scorpion, just a normal, small scorpion, and she did. And so they are both now immortalized in the sky, but when Scorpius rises, Orion sets. And they say he is still fleeing from her. And I hope that now we all will be continuing the work of the scorpion as the hubris of civilization, which has become like an Orion on Earth, goes out of control. And thank you so much for coming together here for the Black Summer Vigil. A particular thank you to Reverend Andrew Errington and the Newtown Erskineville Anglican Church, who have given us haven from the rain at the last minute. I'm sorry I'm speaking so fast because we've gone over time with the rain and everything. But thank you for coming together, and to everyone watching online, thank you so much. And I'll throw it back to Jannawi Dance Clan now, and they're going to, anyone who would like to take part in the healing water ceremony, if you hold, trauma from having, if you have trauma from doing direct action, I encourage you to take part in any way, bushfire or animal related. All right, thank you.
Oh, thank you, Aniqua. We're now going to dance a water dance and then invite anybody up who would like to be a part of our water cleansing ceremony. And my wawa, Jeremy Marika, is from Northeast Arnhem Land. He's been playing the yidaki today. He's going to sing the water song for us, and then everyone just come up, gather around, make a circle. And if you would like to receive a water cleansing and some healing for today, thanks. so I'd like anyone to come up if you'd like to be part of the water cleansing ceremony. Just come up and join us. Just to finish off today, just to wish everybody a safe journey home. We're just going to dance our farewell dance and sing our farewell songs. Thank you. Guaguna banga, guaguna banga, walama, 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 nini langora, nini langora. Guaguna banga, guaguna banga, walama, 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 nini langora, nini langora. Wow.